people demonstrating against Macron. These protests originally started over a green energy fuel tax hike, and it was only last week that Macron withdrew it. But the protests have also been sparked because of the rising cost of living, rising taxes in general, and very permeable borders. A list of the Yellow Vest demands include the following, and I won't read all of this, but if you want to pause the video and go through them, just feel free to. Just a quick glance here and you'll see that by no means can it be said that these people are anti-statist. Anti-globalist? Yes. Populist? Yes. They're also anti-Macron's type of statism. They're not after free markets, individuality, or anything even close. A lot of what they want is good, but the belief that they need government to get it is laughable. And the belief that they can get it from the government at no extra expense to themselves is equally laughable, as if the government can just give jobs to the unemployed. Except in that case they can, it's just at the expense of the taxpayer. They want more taxes on the rich instead of just less taxes for themselves. They're saying how much they want for retirement, minimum wage, and salary, and they're saying the enforcements that they want against rent and housing costs, and asylum seekers are owed housing, security, food, and education, and they want to work with the UN to set up host camps around the world. That all sounds fantastical, destructive, and big government in many ways, but don't get me wrong, there are some demands here that I actually agree with. People who work in France should be subject to the same rights and regulations as the French. That keeps businesses from having unfair advantages caused by other countries. And I agree with ending the austerity policy as well. They're not paying interest on the debt declared illegitimate, which I'm all good with, but they're trying to get the money from tax evaders. And look, I think that taxation is evil, and I wouldn't personally look down on a tax evader, but I understand how these people can feel screwed by tax evaders when France has so many socialist programs that they benefit from, and it's not uncommon for the super rich to evade taxes. In fact, tax evasion is really concentrated at the top of the income distribution. But the problem in France is also addressed when they say that the causes of forced migration must be treated, and unsuccessful refugees must be returned to their country of origin. And as an addition to this, they want a real integration policy because living in France means becoming French. They want language, history, and civic courses taught with certification at the end. And that's excellent. The problem is, the first roadblock that they hit will show whether or not they cave. So wait until the first refugee who's been accepted into France goes through all of these integration classes and then fails to be certified. Will they kick them out, send them back to their home country, tell them it's too bad? I highly doubt it. But there seems to be the fundamental lack of understanding in the West that government is a tool of force. If you're not prepared to hold a gun to someone's head and make them do something, then don't expect the government to do it. One man who's lived in France for 22 years said that he's seen protests in France before, but not like this. It was a 12-hour battle that the witness compared to a civil war. The really telling thing is that a lot of the aggression was directed at not only the riot police, but shrines to the French Republic. That should give you a good idea of where the root of their anger lies. They're specifically mad at the government and the policies of Macron. And sure, he's lowered certain taxes and deregulated in some ways. But let's not forget that he also said that Europe shares destiny with Africa. He had a moment similar to Hillary's deplorable moment where he branded Le Pen's supporters as hateful cowards. He's also been supportive of the idea of an EU army. Because when your ideas are terrible, you need to be able to enforce them at the point of a gun, right? And Macron has said multiple times that we need an EU army to protect against China, Russia, and even the US. And as far as who is protesting exactly, it started with people in rural France and it's moved into the major cities over the weeks. It's essentially working class people on the lower side of the socioeconomic spectrum. The people who have to drive to work and can't rely on public transportation. They're the people upset at the 64% tax on unleaded gas and the 59% tax on diesel, even though it's since been revoked. But regardless, it's the people who pay the most in taxes but receive the least benefits. The people tired of seeing their hard labor being thrown away on a flood of migrants. And a major problem is that the fuel tax was to try to stop global warming, which is hilarious on its own. But the EU wants to flood their countries with migrants who then come to the first world and have a massive carbon footprint and then get the productive natives to pay for it. This goes along with the UN's plan for replacement migration. Weaken the native population in favor of a lower IQ, more desperate, crime-inducing, tax-draining population that breeds like rabbits, because it equals more votes for globalists. These yellow vest protests haven't stayed in France either. There are yellow vests in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Maastricht, and many other places in the Netherlands protesting against political correctness, Prime Minister Mark Rutte, and border permeability. Even somebody who helps coordinate the protests in Paris has said that if Macron withdrew his tax break for the rich, half of the yellow vests would go home. Half wouldn't because they'd want him to resign. They're uncontrollable. So this certainly isn't a movement that's just going to fall by the wayside. And from the looks of it, Macron has a lot to worry about when police start showing solidarity with the yellow vests by taking their helmets off. It also doesn't help Macron that France's tax to GDP ratio is 47.9%, and these protests are causing damage that could amount to 0.1% of their GDP. To give you an idea of how significant even 0.1% is, the US tariffs on China amount to 0.2 to 0.3% of their GDP, and you can see all of the action taking place as a result of that financial stressor. If the violent fringes of the yellow vests are damaging that much, this can't be allowed to simply continue. Now, today, Tuesday, there were Black Tuesday protests despite Macron's €9 billion tax cut, which puts France in a serious financial situation. The EU says they'll be closely monitoring Macron's spending plans as it's suspected he might breach spending rules. Now, when tax breaks are considered spending, you know the country is messed up. I mean, I gave this the same eye roll that I do when leftists say that oil companies get subsidies. But really, it's just tax breaks. They get to keep more of their own money. Regardless, the protests raged on today with students in yellow vests taking to the streets. And Macron made false promises he can't possibly fulfill, saying that employers can give bonuses that will be paid by the government and it'll increase minimum wage, all while the government is hemorrhaging money. They're really stuck between a rock and a hard place where Macron doesn't have money for social programs that the French want, but he also can't raise taxes, and he has the EU breathing down his neck. Now, this clearly isn't a situation that just manifested itself overnight. The degradation of France is long, and it really goes back several decades. Macron just happened to be the globalist that broke the camel's back, and now the working people are revolting. So it's good to see France pushing for change through yet another Western populist movement. It's just a shame that they're pushing for a system that'll land them in the same exact place in a few decades. They won't suddenly adopt true freedom. They'll just keep the French government at bay, but allow them to exist in exchange for government-provided rights paid for through taxation. The main complaints seem to be what the tax money goes towards, the rampant and unchecked migration, and a growing gap between the rich and the poor. So that's all for this video. I hope that you found it helpful to understand what's really going on in France. The riots and protests don't really address the main issue, but it's more than could be expected of most other countries. So thank you all so much for watching. Be sure